do that, Kevin, I want to talk about something that your listeners might not have heard before, which is a little bit more on why it was that Hitler and Germany had to go in the eyes of the international banksters who, after all, have been running things since, well, before the days of Hitler. I'm going to give you two quotes. And this first quote is from Arthur Laurie, who's a British chemist, professor, member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He said this in 1938, quote, "As long as Germany and Italy are under their present governments, they will not touch foreign loans. And Germany, by her method of internal economy and trading, has eliminated the international financier and those who make profits by playing with foreign exchanges. That is doubtless why the government is being forced by the city, meaning London, to start a trade war with Germany. If the economic methods devised by Germany are successful and spread to other nations, if Hitler succeeds in his policy of establishing permanent peace in Europe, the high financier will cease to be able to exist. It is therefore their main interest today to plunge the four powers into war in order to destroy Germany and Italy," unquote, Arthur Laurie, Royal Society, 1938. The second quote is from a guy you've probably heard of, William Guy Carr, in his great book, Pawns in the Game, published in 1955, which I think is one of the best analyses I've ever seen of the Illuminati. This guy was talking about the Bilderbergers in 1955, and man, that's a long time before Daniel Estlund. I don't think
Daniel Estlund was even a gleam in his parents' eye at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Well, William Guy Carr said this in Pawns of the Game, quote, "Hitler antagonized the international bankers when he announced his financial policy and monetary reform program. He persuaded Italy, Spain, and Japan to back him in his determination to challenge the power of cartels and monopolies financed and controlled by the international bankers, particularly their brainchild, the Bank of International Settlements. Since the Great War, meaning World War I, the international bankers had set up 26 central banks. They were modeled after the Federal Reserve. Paul Warburg's creation of 1913 had been steadily attempting to set up a central banking organization which would acknowledge no authority on this planet as above it. Hitler knew that if Warburg and associates had their way, the Bank of International Settlements would become as autocratic as the Bank of England is in British affairs. Hitler decided to take a definite stand and refused to allow Germany to be merged into the League of Monopolistic States secretly controlled by agents of the Illuminati," unquote, William Guy Carr, 1955.
So it sounds like the reason for the war on Hitler was not the good reasons, it was the bad reasons. Just like the war on Saddam Hussein. You know, we didn't fight Saddam Hussein because he was a brutal dictator, which he was. We went after Saddam Hussein because he was using his oil money to help his people, and he was resisting Zionist genocide. So we went after Saddam because of the good things he was doing, not the bad things. And likewise, it sounds like you could make the same case about Hitler.
You could. I also want to, before I talk about the world conquest issue, I do want to mention some other things about Hitler. Besides being an enemy of bankster capitalism and creating a very healthy economy that was based on bartering, they didn't even have any gold because they'd been stripped of it after World War I. He also dismantled the Freemasonic lodges, which the Freemasons and the Illuminati had used for years to control Europe. He banned them. He also banned pornography, which had been rampant under the Weimar Republic before him. He also was obviously an enemy of Bolshevism. He invaded Russia in an attempt to destroy it.
You mentioned Hitler banning pornography, and ironically, supposedly, there's a huge market for Nazi pornography, and it's mostly Jewish people that buy it, which always struck me as very strange.
Yeah, I know that he banned it. I have to investigate that claim a little bit more. But just to complete the thought, he was also, obviously, he and the Germans and Japanese were enemies of world government. They would not be absorbed into a world government because of their fierce nationalism. And obviously, Hitler was also an enemy of the Zionists. And if I told you today that there was a national leader who's the enemy of banksters, pornography, Freemasonry, Bolshevism, world government, and Zionism, you'd probably think that probably sounds like a pretty good guy. So again,
that's pretty much what Merlin Miller is going to come on and advocate in the second hour. and he's about as far from the popular image of Hitler as a demonic, evil, racist dictator as anybody. Merlin is a very sweet guy who actually cares about his country and people, a compassionate fellow. So maybe he could put a new face on some of those policies, shave the mustache off them.
Exactly, and I'm not trying to idealize the society. I find its eugenics policies repugnant, and they built a whole cult of personality around Hitler, which I think is dangerous for any country to do. But let's take a look at the claim that Germany wanted to conquer the world. We've already looked at Japan in that context. I want to point out something that might surprise some of the listeners, which is that no document has ever been found in any German archive indicating that Germany had a plan to conquer the world. Hitler never stated publicly or privately that he wanted to conquer the world, nor did any German general or statesman at any time state that they wanted to conquer the world.
Well, but they wanted a lot of Lebensraum, didn't they?
I think that the invasion of, I'm going to talk about the invasion of Russia in a minute and why that took place. But they don't seem to need any Lebensraum today. I don't think they needed it then. Germany, as far as conquering the world goes, it was the size of Oregon and Washington. Japan was about the size of Montana. And the idea that they could, conquer Britain and occupy it, and then conquer Russia and occupy it, and then have enough left over to come over and conquer and occupy North and South America is ludicrous. For one thing, Kevin, in order to make a land invasion of the United States, to make an attack, you would need air support. That would be essential. The German Navy never had a single aircraft carrier. And I'll just quote Charles Lindbergh on this. He said this for the America First Committee. He said, quote, "Let us not be confused by this talk of invasion. Great armies must still cross oceans by ship. No foreign navy will dare approach within bombing range of our coast," unquote, Charles Lindbergh. What he's pointing out here, the German Navy, they had no aircraft carriers. If they tried to invade us, their transport ships would have simply been bombed to smithereens by our land-based air force. No way they could have done it. And there is not a single shred of evidence that they had a plan of world conquest. Now, in response to this, what some people would say was, well, we don't need documentation. The documentation they have, of course, is just Humphrey Bogart movies and Indiana Jones movies and speeches by Roosevelt. That's their documentation. There is no documentation in Germany. In fact, let me just mention, I had a friend who's passed away. He was a German officer, and during the Battle of the Bulge, he was assigned to command a detachment leading American prisoners behind the lines. And they spent the night in the barn of a French farmhouse, and they found some schnapps and offered it to their American prisoners, and they were sharing this schnapps. And the Germans, one of them spoke pretty good English. He said, we have a question we've always wanted to ask to Americans. And the Americans said, oh, what is it? And they said, well, what are you doing over here in Europe? And so one of the Americans said, well, you see, we have to stop you Germans from conquering the world. Well, my friend Hans and his friends just looked at each other and laughed because nobody in Germany ever heard of that idea before. That idea did not exist in Germany, so I'm going to stress that.
Right, but let's, give up the myth for a second. Let's talk about the geopolitics. Isn't it true, though, that Germany, had it succeeded in incorporating all of the German-speaking regions, which was its kind of minimal aim, and then if it went and pursued some more Lebensraum and subjugated the Slavs, it would have become the fulcrum of Eurasia. It would have organized a whole system around it, and that system would have been probably the most powerful power on Earth.
That is possible, but I want to just take this idea of world conquest and look at it, these invasions, from a different perspective than the Lebensraum you're talking about. I don't think that was the primary motivation for what they were doing. Now, if you ask the average person, they will say, well, we don't need documents in the German archives because the German actions speak for themselves. First, they attacked the Rhineland. They occupied the Rhineland. Then they had the Anschluss with Austria. And then they took back Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland. And so we appeased them. And then finally they had the war with Poland. And that's when the history books will tell you that France and England said, we've had enough, no more appeasement. And then that would be like the first phase of world conquest, as is alleged. The second phase would be the attack on France and the Battle of Britain. That would be the next proof of Germany's supposed intent to conquer the world. And finally, the invasion of Russia. And so let me start with the invasion of Russia, because I think it was for different reasons than are given. The invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, which began on June the 22nd, 1941, actually was a six-nation attack. It was not just the army of Germany, it was the army of Finland, Italy, Romania, Hungary, and Croatia. I should also mention that 47,000 Spanish volunteers joined Operation Barbarossa. Now, Spain was technically neutral, but 47,000 Spaniards left their homeland to attack, and this is because they'd seen the atrocities of the Bolsheviks in their own country before Franco saved them. They'd seen congregations and churches herded into the churches, and the churches burned down with the people inside. They weren't going to put up with it any longer. They looked at Moscow as the center of these atrocities. I should also mention that 2 divisions of Belgian soldiers fought on the Eastern Front alongside the Germans. There was a French-speaking and a Flemish-speaking division. And one of the books that really turned my mind around on this whole issue, Kevin, was a book called Campaign in Russia by Leon de Grelle. He was a Belgian who rose from the rank of private to command the French-speaking division that fought in Russia. He was personally decorated for courage by Hitler, and he was certainly, I want to mention, none of these Belgians were conscripts, nor the Spaniards. They were all volunteers. They were all there for one reason, to destroy Bolshevism off the continent of Europe and Asia, because they'd seen the atrocities that had been committed. The Belgians and the Finns and the Spaniards had no vision of world conquest. And I want to mention one other thing, and people might say, well, the Germans, they wanted world conquest. Kevin, I have read countless memoirs, letters, and diaries of German soldiers during World War II, and they didn't have many diaries. It was actually illegal because if you got captured with a diary, it could give away information, but some of them kept them. I have never seen a German soldier write home to his wife and say, Greta dear, it's so overcrowded there in Berlin, I can hardly wait till we conquer Russia so we can move the kiddies from Berlin here to the frozen steppes of Russia and live here in a thatched roof hut. You know, they hated it in Russia. Every German soldier dreamed of the day he would go home to Germany. This was not about conquering Germany to have living space. I will say that Hitler had his eye on 2 economic objectives, though. One certainly was the granaries of the Ukraine, because Germany had been starved out by Britain by a blockade in World War I. Several 100,000 people died of starvation. He wasn't going to let that happen a second time. And the other thing was the oil in the Southern Caucasus, because they needed that as well. So he certainly did have economic objectives in mind. But the primary purpose of Operation Barbarossa, which was a multinational event, and people really forget this, I think it was just German, which it wasn't, was to destroy Bolshevism off the face of the planet. And that's also why Pearl Harbor had to happen, was to keep the Japanese from entering and attacking from the east.
But if the U.S. powers that be were that friendly to Bolshevism, why did they turn against it so sharply after the war?
Well, now you move into a new phase of history.
Okay, yeah. We don't have to go there yet if you don't want to.
A Marshall Plan, NATO, new alliances, the Iron Curtain being subsidized while we're fighting the Cold War, and you have the UN being validated by the Korean War and a whole other set of objectives.
So it's kind of a strategy
changed.
of tension, you're saying.
The British were the bad guy, were the good guys all during the French and Indian War. The day the war ended, they became the bad guys. I mean,
we've always been at war with Oceania.
Yeah, exactly. And we're at war with Oceania, and we've always been at war with Oceania, and people should know that. So, yeah, they changed their strategies and changed who the enemies are. The Germans changed from bad guys to good guys right after the war, and Russians changed from good guys to bad guys. Same thing with the Chinese and the Japanese. They reversed the villain hats. But I want to mention one last thing about Operation Barbarossa, which was that Stalin had 170 divisions amassed on his eastern border. There was a plan to invade Western Europe by Stalin. Even Brezhnev, Soviet Premier Brezhnev, admitted this in the 1970s, that Stalin was planning to invade Europe. If you ever wondered why the Germans and their allies captured so many soldiers in the opening month of the war, it's because Stalin's troops were bunched at his eastern front, his western front, preparing for invasion. They were not arrayed in depth for defense. He was planning to invade. Operation Barbarossa was a preemptive strike. I have to say that I understand exactly the motives. I don't look at it in the same way as mainstream media does. I believe that this was an attempt to destroy the threat of Stalin and Bolshevism for once and for all. But we can. I want to move back to the war on France and Britain, which is the other, the earlier supposed proof of Germany's plan to conquer the world. But before I do that, I want to throw it back to you because you may have comment.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say that I don't think any serious person who's actually read some of the history would ever assert that Germany was planning to directly conquer the world. But those who are more sophisticated in their understanding of geopolitics would probably say that Germany was seeking to supplant England as the dominant force in Europe and to create an order, a new European order in which Germany would be the prime, center of power. And then the argument goes among the geostrategists who would support fighting against Germany in the war, they would say that this kind of Eurasia with, had Germany triumphed and established itself as the dominant force in Europe and indeed in the Eurasian continent, that then these bad values of racism and so on, militarism, these would have been spread all over the place, and that would have been really bad, even though they weren't out to conquer the world.
Yeah, I don't think those values, which could be challenged, would be any worse than communism and the Iron Curtain, and the outcome that we did get, which besides the engulfment of the Balkans and all of the Asian mainland, we got the Vietnam War and the Korean War out of our interventions. If we'd let Japan and Germany take care of business with Stalin, I think it would have been quite different. I know you had Joshua Blakeney on. I'm familiar with his new book, which contains documents that were censored. Most people don't know that the American occupation forces destroyed 7,000 different documents and books, and I mean not copies, but 7,000 different books and documents explaining Japan's strategy. And in Joshua's book makes it very plain that Japan envisioned that if they didn't intervene, that communism would engulf Asia. They were exactly right. That's exactly what happened. But I want to move on to England, if we may. The invasion of France and England is supposed to prove that Germany wanted to conquer the world, and as I mentioned, I have a lot of memoirs of German soldiers, and I'm holding one. It's a rare one by Armin Scheidenbauer called "Adventures in My Youth: A German Soldier on the Eastern Front." And I'm quoting him because he's a Christian. I'm just quoting from his biography on the jacket. It's Armin Scheidenbauer was born in 1924, the son of an evangelical pastor. It goes on to describe his academic achievements and then how his combat record on the Eastern Front is many times wounded. And it says in March 1940, he was wounded and captured by the Red Army in March 1945, returning home in September 1947. In the post-war years, he became a senior lawyer in Vienna and continued his close associations with the evangelical church. He married a doctor and had a daughter, also a doctor for whom this memoir was originally written. That's from the jacket. It was not intended for publication, but in this book he explains why Germany went to war with Britain and England, and he says it's very simple. They declared war on us. And, when you're a country and then the other countries declare war on you, you have to fight them, and that was the reason. And, of course, the war with France was very quick, and people call the Blitzkrieg a very cruel form of warfare. I want to point out, I know I'm saying a lot of contrary thoughts tonight, but the Germans, like the French, had the experience of World War I, where for years millions of soldiers died on each side in trench warfare. They weren't going to have that. They said, we're going to do one and done. We're going to go in with air mobilized forces. We're going to win this thing fast, and then it's over. And the other thing I want to mention about that, there's, of course, great talk about Dunkirk, and there's controversy about it, but I do want to mention that there's plenty of evidence that the Germans allowed the British to leave at Dunkirk. I'm not diminishing the valor of the men who committed small craft and brought those troops over. But the Germans thought the war was over. France had surrendered. The British had been beaten on the ground. And I'll give you just one quote because we're pressed for time. This is from General Gunther Blumentritt on visiting Hitler's headquarters. Quote, "He then astonished us by speaking of his admiration of the British Empire, of the necessity for its existence, and of the civilization that Britain had brought to the world. He concluded by saying that his aim was to make peace with Britain on the basis that she would regard as compatible with her honor to accept," unquote.
Right, I think Pat Buchanan talks about this in his book on the unnecessary war.
Yes, it's called Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. And I want to mention that as far as the alleged, supposed plan to invade Britain goes, there were 3.8 million German troops in France at the time the armistice was signed in 1940. Immediately, they demobilized 3.3 million and withdrew them to France, leaving behind an occupation force of 500,000 men. They obviously were not planning to invade Britain. And Pat Buchanan, you mentioned him in his book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Necessary War. He points out that Hitler never built any landing barges or troop ships or tank ferries. If he was planning to invade Britain, he would have done so. There was on paper something called Operation Sea Lion. That was a bluff. He never looked at the plans. And there was a rule in German headquarters that if Hitler didn't look at plans, he had no intention of carrying out. It was a bluff, basically not only to get Churchill to end the war, but also to distract Stalin and while he was moving his troops to the Eastern Front to fight that, what I consider a preemptive war against the Soviet Union. But Churchill certainly knew from the decoders at Bletchley Park that the Germans had no intention of invading his country. So the question is, after France surrendered, why did this war continue? And your average person will say it's because Germany wanted to invade and conquer Britain. Everybody knows that. I would disagree.
Buchanan argues the British could have just easily had a peace treaty.
Yes.
At all of these points, even before that, they could have had a peace treaty and just basically let the Germans absorb all the German-speaking regions that they'd taken back, and the Germans would have been happy to just stay there. But who knows?
Kevin, I want to mention that the reason that the war did not end, the Germans made, believe it or not, more than 20 peace offers to Britain. I was aware of about 8 of them until I read an excellent book recently published by Dana Spangolas called The Ruling Elite, Volume 3, and she documents that there were 20 peace offers. I'm going to discuss the most important one. But they offered peace through every neutral country, the United States, Turkey, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden. They were constantly offering peace, and on terms favorable to Britain. They didn't want any colonies. They didn't want the British Navy. They just wanted to end this war. And the reason it continued was because Churchill, who was under the control of the Zionist banksters, insisted on continuing it. And there's the story, of course, of the London Blitz, and we've all heard the stories of the brave Londoners facing the German bombs. So who bombed who first? I'm going to give you some quotes from the British on this, okay? The first is from J.M. Spate, Principal Secretary to the RAF. Quote, Hitler only undertook the bombing of British civilian targets reluctantly 3 months after the RAF had commenced bombing German civilian targets. Hitler would have been willing at any time to stop the slaughter. Hitler was genuinely anxious to reach with Britain an agreement confining the action of aircraft to battle zones, unquote, J.M. Spate. The second quote I'll give you on this is from Dennis Richards in his book, The Royal Air Force, 1939 to 1945, published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office. Quote, the primary purpose of these raids was to goad the Germans into undertaking reprisal raids of a similar character on Britain. Such raids would arouse intense indignation in Britain against Germany and so create a war psychosis without which it would be impossible to carry on a modern war, unquote.
Very interesting. Sounds a little bit like what they're doing now with ISIS and the so-called war on terror.
Yeah, you create a war psychosis by making you think that you're the victim, and you don't realize that it's actually your guys who are carrying out these deeds. I should mention there were about 60,000 British casualties from the German bombing, but many more times that many died in a single night in the bombing of Dresden. I probably don't need to go over that stuff, but when they bombed Hamburg with incendiary bombs, the temperatures reached 1,800 degrees. The winds were 150 miles an hour, and even the asphalt melted, and they say that children running down the street actually seemed to burst into flaming torches. This is all in contravention of the Geneva Convention. So you want to talk about
it had no military purpose either. It was pure, sadistic torture of civilians.
Right. So if you want to talk about a Holocaust, that's a pretty good example of one. Churchill was under the control of the Zionist bankers. Bernard Baruch had bailed him out after the 1929 stock crash. And when Churchill took more stock losses in the 1937, he was bailed out by Henry Strakosch, who was a Zionist gold mining magnate. And then he came under the direct influence of what's called the Focus Group, whose leader was as a Zionist Robert Whaley Cohen, the managing director of Royal Dutch Oil. So he was bailed out. He was under their thumb and the thumb of Victor Rothschild and the rest of the Zionist bankers, and they insisted he carry on this war, which was unnecessary. He could have had peace at any time. I want to talk about, we could talk about the peace offers Germany made, but I want to talk about what I consider the most important one, because this is the one, Kevin, that totally changed my view of World War II. It was the Rudolf Hess case. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah. Didn't Rudolf Hess, fly to England?
Yes. Rudolf Hess was the deputy Führer of Germany. He was the only person in Germany who had the authority to sign a peace treaty. And after all these other peace dealers had been rejected, in fact, let me give a quote from Churchill after the Vatican approached him with a German offer. He said, quote, "I hope will be made clear to the nuncio that we do not desire any inquiries as to terms of peace with Hitler. All our agents are strictly forbidden to entertain any such suggestions," unquote. And he threw many people in prison who tried to negotiate peace. But Rudolf Hess flew May the 10th, 1941, an unarmed Messerschmitt fighter right through the British defenses. He parachuted to the ground, which was not his plan. That was not the original plan. He was supposed to meet some people at an airstrip. Didn't work out. But he was captured by the Scottish Home Guard and then fell under Churchill, who threw him in the Tower of London. And the initial press headlines were Hess. They couldn't deny that he was in Britain because too many people had seen him. So they said, Hess flees Britain, Hess flees Hitler. Well, that didn't make sense because he was fleeing the Third Reich. Why didn't he have a press conference and denounce the Third Reich, okay? They put him in the Tower of London. Now, he came with a peace offer which included complete withdrawal from France. This is mentioned by Peter Padfield, the late British historian, in his book. It was complete withdrawal from France, negotiate the future of Poland, end the war completely. The timing is not coincidental. The date of Hess's flight was May the 10th, 1941. What happened 1 month later? June the 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Germany did not want a two-front war. They were desperate to end this war with Germany and with England, and that's why the deputy Führer himself, Rudolf Hess, flew there. But what happened was the local Scottish newspapers got wind of the fact that Hess said he came to offer peace. This made a press release across the Atlantic, was picked up by American Mercury magazine, was seen by some American congressmen who started inquiring of Roosevelt, and now Roosevelt and Churchill had a great big problem, so they changed their story. And Churchill's new story became, Hess is a madman. He's a lunatic, and he was advised by his press baron, Lord Beaverbrook, to start sending psychiatrists to see Hess. And one of the psychiatrists they sent to see him was none other than the man who developed MK Ultra. Sorry, my just going a little bit blank.
I don't remember who that was either. MK Ultra being the CIA mind control program.
Right, but that was one of the psychiatrists who they sent to see him. Sorry, it's Donald Cameron. I'm sorry, Donald Cameron.
Really, Dr. Cameron?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
he's famous for having destroyed a lot of people's brains in those Canadian experiments, right?
And you can be sure that's what he was doing to Hess's brain, because they wanted him to look crazy by the time he got to Nuremberg. Now, this story gets very, very interesting. In 1947, at the Nuremberg trials, the Russian and English judges asked for death for Rudolf Hess, but the American and French judges said, we don't see this guy has done anything deserving of death. We'll favor a life sentence. And at Nuremberg, you had to have 3 out of 4 judges to give you a death sentence. So he went to Spandau prison with many other sentencees from Nuremberg. And here a great mystery unfolds. Now, by 1967, all the other prisoners at Spandau were gone. But Hess remained as a sole inmate of this prison, which was designed to hold 600 prisoners. He was kept under a guard of 200 rotating soldiers, French, Russian, American, and British. And the cost was $100 million a year, $100 million. And people started saying, why is this guy being kept here? Why can't you just send the guy home and spend $100 million? And the British government claimed is because the Russians were obstinate and they hated Hess. Well, then Gorbachev came to power and he's asked at a press conference, what about Rudolf Hess? And Gorbachev said, well, he can go home. We've got nothing against the guy. So you might be interested to know that his nurse at Spandau prison was I believe he was a Muslim. His name was Abdallah Melahuhi. He's written a book called Rudolf Hess's Betrayal and Murder. When his nurse told him, "You will be released, Mr. Hess," he said, "No, the British will murder me. I will never get out of this prison." Well, in 1987, he was all set for release, and then the news flash came around the world in the mainstream media. Rudolf Hess commits suicide by hanging at Spandau. Now, this guy had been in prison for 46 years. He's about to be released to his loving family. Why does he hang himself? How much time do we have left?